you to our beginning session of another Wednesday night series and reiterate what I've said before, and that is one of the really pleasant surprises for me in the shape that St. Luke's ministry has taken is the way that this particular offering of ministry has developed. I never dreamed back in the September of '87 that we would have this kind of response, and I know that there are probably many reasons for it. I think the time of the week that it is obviously makes it more accessible to our highly mobile parish where the weekends involve so much travel. I suppose that the middle of the week also offers an occasion where you would like to have some kind of lift and some way between Monday and Friday to be energized. I'm also confident that the food that we eat before we have this particular kind of feeding is a crucial component to the Christian faith. Has always put great emphasis on eating together. There's something about table fellowship that does lots of mysterious things to us. So for whatever the reason, I welcome you. I really am happy to have you as a part of this. And tonight we're beginning the fourth of the offerings that we've had this year. I did the teaching this fall on different characters of the Old Testament. January and February we had in 5 wonderful interpreters to talk about if they just had one last sermon to preach, what would it be? And I was personally greatly helped by all of that. During our Lenten season, Rondell Bain and the Outreach Committee provided us really good stimulation in terms of sensitizing us to things that we could do in the world. And tonight I would like to pick up on the same theme that I followed this fall, and again focus your attention on certain pivotal figures in the Old Testament heritage. I'm reading a book right now called Iron John by the poet Robert Bly, and he makes the assertion in the introduction that what instincts are to animals, stories are to human beings. He says that the wisdom to know how to build a nest, or how to get back to the wintering place of migration, or how to do the mating process, all of that is stored in the instincts of the animal kingdom. However, human beings have a different set of capacities. We can reflect on our experience, we can remember, we can share with each other what our experiences are, and therefore what instincts are to the birds of the air, stories remembered, assimilated, and shared with each other are to human beings. And I think that's a very profound insight. And for me, at least, it makes the Bible take on a new kind of significance, because the Bible has many different kinds of literature in it, but it is essentially the family scrapbook, if you will, the family album that tells the stories of literally hundreds of people as they have lived in the same world we live in, as they've had to face what we have to face. And the wisdom that can come from shared story is a wonderful resource. And so what I would like for us to do for these next 6 Wednesday nights is to simply keep on sharing in the stories of the Old Testament, focusing each week on one individual of pivotal significance. And whereas I haven't intended for this year's study to be a kind of detailed course in Old Testament survey, I thought it might be helpful tonight if I would simply show you where we are in the unfolding of Old Testament history and locate for you the particular kinds of people that I want to be talking about for tonight in the next 5 Wednesday nights. Roughly 1800 BC, well, that's just about 4,000 years ago now, what we know as biblical history came into existence. We have no way of knowing how old the whole cosmos is, but about 4,000 years ago, give or take a few hundred years, a God named Yahweh appeared to a man named Abraham and said, I want to bless you. I want to meet your needs. I want to bring you to the fullness of your potential. And I want you to go with me on a journey to a land that I'm going to give you. I'm going to make you full of descendants so that your lineage will continue. I'm going to make it so that your name will be remembered, and eventually every other creature on this earth is going to be blessed because of what we're going to begin together. And so that was the beginning of what I'll call the patriarchal and matriarchal section. The 12th to the last chapter of Genesis is the wonderfully complex and dense account of these matriarchs and patriarchs that make up the earliest part of the biblical story. There's Abraham and Sarah, there is Isaac and Rebekah, there's Jacob and Rachel, there's Joseph and his brothers. And so for about the first 300 years we have this family beginning to take shape and like a river to gather more and more people. And at the end of this period, this first period of biblical history, you will remember that a famine had come, and Joseph had been sold by his brothers into Egypt and had been instrumental in collecting a surplus of food. And so the whole family, descendants of Abraham, go down to Egypt. And so for the next 300 years, from about 1500 BC to 1200 BC, I'll call it the Egyptian sojourn. They went down under very favorable circumstances. Joseph was number 2 man in the whole country. But as time unfolded, they began to grow, and this is descriptive and not critical, but Jewish people tend to be very aggressive. They tend to really make themselves felt wherever they are, and therefore can be threatening. And so the Egyptian attitude toward the Hebrews turned to hostility, and they were reduced to slavery. And around 1200 BC, one of their own, Moses, who was an interesting combination of having gotten to go to school with the Egyptians but being a Hebrew by nature, he was instrumental in leading the children of Israel out of that Egyptian captivity, out of the slavery to which they had sunk. And so for about 50 years you have the Exodus coming out of Egypt, the wandering in the wilderness, the receiving the Ten Commandments, and then the entering back into the land that had been promised to Abraham. They realized in 1800 BC, Abraham had started over where Iran and Iraq are today, ironically, a part of the world that's focusing so much attention on right now. It migrated to the west to what we know today as Palestine, had gone down to Egypt. Now in about 1200 they come back, that they start back, and at about 1150 BC they finally re-enter this land that had been promised to Abraham. And for about 150 years they simply lived together, not in any kind of organized government. God would raise up a hero judge like Samson or Gideon when there was a crisis, but they didn't have any unifying government. And then around 1050 the need for some kind of centralized monarchy began to make itself felt. And so you have 3 kings. Saul was the first. David was the shining hero. His son Solomon followed him and consolidated Israel and made it into a highly taxed and highly organized kingdom. And then about 950, that was the monarchy period, Saul, David, and Solomon. And then about 950 BC, when Solomon died, he didn't have a son strong enough to hold things together. And so just like in this country, where you have the north and the south, a natural division, the 10 tribes of Israel in the north became a separate kingdom called Israel. The 2 tribes in the south called Judah became another kingdom, and so they were divided from 950 on. In 721, the Assyrians came like a swarm of locusts and simply overwhelmed the northern kingdom. You've probably heard the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Those particular folks simply were assimilated into the Assyrian Empire and disappeared. And in 586 BC, the little kingdom of Judah was overwhelmed by the Babylonians, and they were taken into captivity. And it was during this time of the divided kingdom, when the great zenith of political power that they had known under David had begun to slip away, that you have a very creative and unusual group of people called prophets who appear to interpret for us and for their own time a deeper insight into what life is, how we are to relate to God. Now, when you hear the word prophet, you probably automatically think of the future. You know, a prophecy has to do with something that is going to happen out there. And there's a sense in which this is true, but the genius of the prophets are not that they can jump ahead in time. The genius of the prophet is that they see more deeply into the present than most of us, and therefore sense where the present is going. And therefore they have inklings of what lie ahead because of their depth perception into what is. And what I would like to do for these next 6 Wednesday nights is to take 6 of these very, very insightful interpreters, discerners, as I will say, the people who see deeply into this mystery that we call life. And I'd like for us to try to learn what they had to teach the people of their day and of every day. I'd like for their stories to become part of the resource that we have to work with our own lives. So tonight I want to talk about Elijah, perhaps the most colorful, really, really intriguing and interesting individual. And next week I want to talk about Amos, the next week Hosea. Then I want to talk about Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, 3 who come toward the very end of this divided kingdom period. And I'd like for us to let these individuals who saw so profoundly into the way it is and therefore sense the way that it was going to be, become resources and brothers in sharing their stories with us. So to that kind of enterprise, I welcome you. We're going to connect up with the story of how God has been moving through history among this particular people. And I pray that these stories will connect themselves to your story, so that every Wednesday night when you leave, you'll have a little more to work with and a little more energy and wisdom for the living of your days and for the writing of your own particular story. We're here together. We're also here in the presence of the Blessed Holy One. Let us invoke an awareness of that presence as we pray together. Let us pray. Oh God, we thank you for the gift of gathering this night, and for the fact that on the left and on the right we are comforted to sense that we're not alone. We thank you for the gift of memory, our own experiences and stories that help us, and also the long memory of the people of God that we find in Holy Scripture. I pray now that your Spirit would come as a living, invigorating energy and open us to ways in which you can bless us as you want to do from your deepest being. Into your hands we give ourselves. We open our sails. We invite you to take us exactly where the winds of your Spirit would have us go. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Sometime in the 9th century, which means sometime in the 800s BC, there appears the first prophetic figure that I want us to talk about, and that is the man named Elijah. Elijah is bracketed, I'm suggesting, by mystery in that both his origins and his ending of life have a kind of luminous and a most mysterious quality. We're told nothing about his background. We don't know who his father and mother were. We're simply told that he is a Tishbite, which was a section of northern Palestine up in the northern kingdom, and all we know is that that's the part of Palestine that he came from. And we have no sense other than that of how it was that he came into the world or who his parents were. At the end of his life, Elijah is one of the 2 people in the biblical record that did not die and was buried, as are most of us, but rather Enoch, who simply walked with God and was no more. And then Elijah is the other person that the record says did not end his earthly journey the way we do, but rather he went out by himself, crossed the Jordan River, and as his disciples watched, a chariot of fire made up of horses of fire and a chariot of fire simply descended like a whirlwind and caught him up, and he simply ascended into heaven the way the flame would send up its smoke into the heavens. It was a most unusual and amazing way of ending the earthly pilgrimage. At first they didn't believe it. And so they spent 3 days looking all around, thinking that a desert whirlwind had picked him up and maybe dumped him off somewhere else. And when they could not find him, then they began to realize that they were in touch with a truly, truly unique human being. And for that reason, the Jewish people have always expected Elijah to come back and be the one who announced the coming of the Messiah. Now, you've all heard the old black spiritual, swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Well, that image originates in the Elijah saga of stories, that descending of something, fire, an old image of God, and lifting that one into the next realm of existence. That's where that very, very picturesque image comes from. And it's so interesting to me. I was reading this week an essay that Elie Wiesel, the Jewish interpreter of the Holocaust, had on Elijah, and he said it's amazing how across these 20 centuries the Jews have always had a special hope that Elijah would come back and announce the coming of the Messiah. Now, a few years ago I made a good friendship with a Jewish rabbi. He invited me and my family to come to his house for a Seder supper, which was the beginning of Passover. If you've ever been to a Passover celebration, then you probably notice that they always leave the front door ajar. They always have one table, one chair set that nobody else sits in. They always pour a glass of wine at that particular chair, and it's all for Elijah. They're always expecting Elijah to come. And you'll remember that when Jesus made his appearance in Galilee, the first thing that the Jews thought was, this is Elijah, come back to announce the coming of the Messiah. And what I'm suggesting is that we're in touch here with a very, very vivid set of stories. Elijah has made an impact on the imagination of the Hebrew people that is unique, I think, in biblical lore. And therefore there's got to be a rich vein of meaning clustered around the accounts that we have of this man's life. And I'd like to very quickly just identify some of the things about the life of this one that has made him such a memorable figure to the Hebrew people. The first thing that I would like to point out is that he was a man unusual for his courage. Elijah the courageous would be one very good descriptive image of him. When we first see Elijah stepping on the stage of history, he confronts the king of the northern section of Palestine, Israel, a man named Ahab, and dares to say to the king that the drought that is at that moment gripping the country of Palestine was directly related to the behavior, the sinful behavior of the life in the palace and the people of Israel. Here's one of the first indications in the biblical story that there is some kind of connection between the way human beings act and the shape of nature and the shape of the cosmos that is all about us. Now today we are very, very conscious that nature can certainly do things to human beings. Last Thursday night, who can deny that obvious fact, that the forces of nature directly affect the fortunes of human beings? What is also true is that the behavior of human beings has a way of affecting even the natural order. They say that our interdependent relationship is much like one of these hanging mobiles. If you touch one piece of it, all the pieces begin to quiver. All of them are affected. There is an interrelation between the forces of nature and human behavior that is very, very real, though very, very mysterious. And so he was the first one to suggest that the way people behave is going to affect even the very atmosphere that we breathe and the earth that is under our feet. I was coming back on a plane the other night, and the lady sitting next to me was reading John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, and she said she'd always heard about it but had never read it. And so we talked a little about that book and how it is a slice of American history. And you may remember that what Steinbeck is working with are the terrible dust storms that developed out in the Midwest because there had been a greedy plowing up of land without a realization of what it was doing to the ecological balance, and that caused the dust bowls, and that caused droughts, and that caused no crops. And so the Okies had to try to survive like the Kurdish people at this moment by becoming refugees and fleeing to California, and that's what Steinbeck describes in that powerful novel. Well, there's another indication that there is an interrelation between human behavior and the whole shape of the cosmos. And I would predict that increasingly, as this century ends and as the 21st century begins, the whole issue of ecology is going to become more and more significant, as we have to learn more deeply how what we do has an effect on nature as surely as what nature is has an effect upon us. And we're going to have to grow, I think, in our harmonious understanding of how we are to relate to nature and how we are to use this dear Mother Earth that has given us birth in ways that won't destroy her and in the process destroy us. Well, Elijah was one of the first to alert us to the fact that what humans do does have cosmic implications to it. And it took courage to confront the king and say this natural disaster that we're experiencing is somehow related to how you and the people in the palace are behaving. Now, usually in our culture, we confuse the messenger and the message. Back in ancient times, if a messenger brought the word that the battle had been won by the army, then they made the messenger a hero. If he brought the word that the army was losing, then they killed the messenger, somehow identifying the one who bears it with the message itself. Well, this is exactly what Ahab did. He immediately got hostile at Elijah for even suggesting such a thing. And so Elijah has to flee out away from the king, and he goes and lives down by the Jordan River, lives alone, which took another kind of courage. One kind of courage to face up to a principality and power, another kind of courage in that day to live by yourself amid the wild animals, amid all kinds of bandits that were wandering around. People in that day still moved around in clans, that they didn't go by themselves. The era of the individual was just barely dawning. That's what makes Abraham's launching out so significant. What makes Jacob fleeing over to Laban's house so unusual. Well, Elijah had the courage to live alone and to go down and by himself learn how to make a place for himself in the world. When the drought caused the water down the Jordan River to dry up, he goes up to Phoenicia, and there he boards with a widow and her son. And it's very interesting that while he's there, the widow's son gets sick and dies. And the widow reacts like most of us humans do. That is, when she saw this terrible thing happening, she immediately said, God is judging me for some sin in my life. This is the other extreme from what I've suggested about not realizing that our human behavior affects the cosmos. Just like it's possible to think that we have too little impact on things, it is also possible to take too much responsibility for what we humans have done or failed to do. I've told you before about a therapist I had down in New Orleans who used to say to me that excessive guilt was simply the shadow side of pride. He said, it's acting like you are the most powerful factor in the universe and that everything bad that happens is your fault. And of course that's not true. You and I play one hand in a complex game. I've seen so many people, when somebody dies in the family, immediately assume that they are to blame because they somehow have done something wrong and are being punished. Well, Elijah didn't accept that interpretation. He asked for the corpse of the boy. He goes up on the roof and he prays to God and then does something absolutely extraordinary for that time. He bent over and engaged in a kind of mouth-to-mouth resuscitation. Now, you need to realize that ancient people were totally terrified of a corpse. Once the animating life breath had left a body, they wanted to have nothing whatsoever to do with that. In fact, to touch a corpse was to make yourself unclean. One of the hunches as to why the priest and Levite didn't stop to help the man in the parable of the Good Samaritan is that they thought he was dead already, and therefore to touch him would have defiled them. For Elijah to have the courage to reach over and put his mouth next to the mouth of one from whom the spirit of life had departed. To have that kind of intimacy with a dead corpse, again, it shows a kind of courage, a wonderful kind of courage that was willing to go beyond the conventions of the day. Therefore, the first thing that singles out Elijah, and one of the reasons why I think he is so remembered by the Hebrew people, is that he had the courage to confront kings. He had the ingenuity and courage to live by himself in the wilderness. He was even willing to get close to death and not to be absolutely traumatized by it. And as we'll see in a moment, when it came his time to end his journey, he doesn't ask for everybody that he loves to be with him as if he was scared to death, but he ventured out by himself, and it was there that the chariot of fire came and took him up into the next life. So he is a wonderful, wonderful model of that sense of confidence that I have enough to meet whatever it is that is there, and out of that confidence to respond to every kind of situation with a great deal of courage. Second thing I want to say about Elijah is that he was also remarkable in his power of discernment. Elijah the discerner, Elijah the interpreter. It is in this sense that he qualifies for being called a prophet, a man who seemed to have spiritual x-ray eyes to look down to the bottom of things and to see what it was and therefore what was likely to come out of it. Now, Elijah sized up the problem in the 9th century B.C. very, very clearly. And the problem was one of spiritual confusion. In fact, you might even say spiritual schizophrenia. I would have put that up here if I could have spelled schizophrenia, but I couldn't, and so I'm just going to settle for confusion. But he sensed that what was happening was that the people had two very different visions of what ultimate reality was like. And just like you can't walk in two directions, opposite directions at the same time, you can't ride a horse that is going east and a horse that's going west and not get split right in two. He realized that two ultimate visions of reality were contending with each other, and the royal household was somehow trying to embrace them both simultaneously, and it was leading to a terrible time of confusion. You need to realize that Ahab, king of the northern kingdom, had married a beautiful Phoenician princess named Jezebel, another name that probably resonates in your imagination. Jezebel was beautiful, she was strong, she was very, very aggressive, and she was a devotee to the primitive pagan religion that was all over that part of the world at this particular time. She was a worshiper of the gods Baal, B-A-A-L. And when she married this man who was a descendant of Abraham and who had received through Abraham this vision of God, Yahweh, who says, I want to bless. When you tried to bring these two religious systems together into one family and tried somehow to live with both of them at the same time, it simply is as impossible as walking north and south at the same time. Now let me very quickly try to explain to you what is so different about the religious vision that is summed up in Baalism and the religious vision that is summed up in Yahwehism, or the worship of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. There are two crucial distinctions. Baalism was a religious vision that said there were any number of gods, each one contending with each other and therefore shaping reality out of that contention. If there are 1,000 different powers back of reality, each one affecting what is happening on the stage of history, it doesn't take a genius to see that that's going to lead to all kinds of instability. Who knows which god tomorrow may get the upper hand? Who knows what is going to happen in the next 30 minutes? Because if there is this civil war in heaven going on all the time between all these contending deities, there is no way to have any confidence about the future. Now, Yahwehism made the breathtaking assertion for 1800 BC that there is a single God behind all reality, that reality emanates from one source and one source only, and though there is great diversity in what this Creator has called into being, at the core of reality, there is a single mentality, there is a single reality, and the coherence that we are finding in our experience in the universe is rooted in that vision that is called monotheism versus that idea that reality is made up of 1,000 different contending forces, and who knows who's going to come out on top next. We call this in the West a universe, which means this creation has a single source behind it all. And we are so used to that in our thinking that we just take it for granted. For example, last Friday I drove out to the airport, parked my car on level D, looked carefully at the number 144, got on a plane and went to North Carolina to help with Jimmy Mac's wedding, then got on a plane and went to Chicago and did a telecast there on Sunday afternoon, came back Sunday night without any great surprise, walked back to level D, to the place 144, and there was the same car that I had left 2 days before. This is a universe. There is a coherence to reality. There's diversity, yes, but the sun comes up in the east every morning and goes down in the west. There is a kind of order that grows out of saying that reality emanates from a single source. You do not have that in polytheism. If there are 1,000 different gods and all are contending and you never know which one is going to be on top when, it makes for profound confusion and a sense that one can make absolutely no point of life. A more important difference between Baalism and Yahwehism is that the worshippers of Baal believe that those 1,000 contending deities, all different and all angry and all working against each other, that these deities were at best indifferent to human beings, and at worst they were cruel and hostile and downright destructive. They believe that not only is there no stability in heaven, but there is nothing there to which human beings can look with any kind of trust. Therefore, the reason that primitive religion had so much emphasis on sacrifice, so much trying to somehow send up an incense that would make whatever is up there feel kindly disposed, it was a pitiful, placating, begging, helpless kind of religion in which these hostile and indifferent deities were somehow besought, can we do anything to maybe get you to at least be kind to us and not to destroy us. And one of the notions that lives on to this very day is that whatever there is out there in the ultimate realm that we designate the divine, one of the deepest fears is that that is simply a black hole of destruction and indifference, and we who live on this earth do not matter anything at all to whatever it is that is up in heaven. Now, over against that is this incredible assertion that came first to Abraham. The one who inhabited the heavens comes and says, I want to bless you. It is my nature to want to see to it that you be and that you grow. I understand who you are because I created you. And I know you have needs for security, so I'm going to give you a land to call your own. I know you have a need for relationships, and so I'm going to give you descendants more numerous than the sky. I know you have a hunger for significance, and I'm going to make your name memorable. I know there is in you this desire to somehow see your life as a blessing, and I'm going to see that that is the outcome of your existence. In other words, to think that there is one ultimate core of reality who at heart wants to bless and fulfill creation is absolutely 180 degrees off from thinking that there are 1,000,000 or 1,000 contending deities and that none of those deities have any positive predisposition to do anything for human beings. Now, the reason that sacrifice finally dropped out of Hebrew practice and why here in the Christian tradition we don't offer animals every Sunday, hoping against hope that we can somehow make it smell good up in heaven and therefore they'll feel good toward us. The reason is that at last it's begun to sink in that the one to whom we relate is the one who wants to bless. Well, now Elijah saw that in the Phoenician worship of Baalism headed up by Jezebel, and the old traditions of Yahwehism that were represented by King Ahab, that you had this impossible a spiritual confusion. Here they were, as Elijah realized, limping along between two opinions, hopping first on this foot and on that foot, and it is simply absolute insanity to try to believe at one and the same time that there are 1,000 different deities who could not care anything for humanity. There is one source of reality that is kindly disposed to us. And he realized that the people's problem was that they were caught. They had not made a commitment either way. They were one day this way and one day that way, which is why their life was so chaotic. And so one day Elijah sees Ahab in the middle of the road, and Ahab says, "You are the troubler of Israel," to Elijah. And Elijah said, "No, Ahab, you are the troubler of Israel because of your spiritual schizophrenia, and it's time, God tells me, for us to have a theological showdown. There is time for us to find out which of these contending visions is true to the real." And so the great dramatic moment in the story of Elijah is when he has all the children of Israel to come to Mount Carmel. It is a high peak just east of the city of Haifa today. Has them come up on this particularly high mountain, and he challenges the 450 prophets of Baal that Jezebel had imported from Phoenicia to come there and to have a contest with him. Cecil B. DeMille would love this, because here is all the drama in the world. You get everybody together and say, okay, we're going to find out once and for all, will the real God please stand up and show himself, herself, itself, whatever, show what is the ultimate truth about reality. And so here you've got the whole nation. Elijah has been led to say, okay, you prophets of Baal, you build an altar, I'll build an altar. You pick an ox and you kill it and you put it on your altar, I'll kill an ox and I'll put it on my altar. Now, you ask your gods to kindle this fire and make a sacrifice, and then I'll ask my God to do the same thing, and let's see what happens. Well, that's the setting for this incredible moment in religious history. Beginning at 9 o'clock in the morning, the prophets of Baal go through all of their frenzied dances. They beg, they plead, they prostrate themselves. When nothing comes from heaven, they begin to slash their wrist. You see, if you believe that whatever it is that is divine could care less for human beings, then you probably think that seeing self-mutilation maybe will appeal to something in the kinkiness of heaven. You know, maybe mutilation will make those, whatever they are, be more kindly disposed. Do you remember how in King Lear, Shakespeare, the Duke of Gloucester, after having his eyes put out, says, "As flies to wanton boys are we men to the gods." Have you ever known little boys in their cruel stage to catch flies and then with some measure of cruelty just pull the wings apart and just literally cause pain and disintegration for creation? As flies to wanton boys are we men to the gods. We are their sport, killing us. Well, if that's your vision, then making all kinds of self-mutilation is a twisted hope that maybe you can get something good coming back. And so for 3 hours they go through that, and the heavens remain as silent as an absolute tomb. And when they have spent themselves, frustrated themselves, cut themselves to pieces, Elijah begins gently to make fun and say, "Do you reckon your gods are asleep? Or do you reckon they've gone away on a journey? Could it be that they really don't care about what happens to you?" Which, of course, is the logical conclusion of paganism. That after they had done what they did and nothing answered back, with a kind of serene and absolute confidence. This discerner of the heart of reality steps up and everybody gets quiet. He first of all has 4 buckets of water poured on the altar so that there can be no suggestion that he's planted some kind of fire. He makes sure that it is absolutely soaked, and then, not cutting himself or dancing in frenzy, he simply says, Lord God of the universe, Father, Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, show to these your people who you really are. And the minute he asks it, fire falls from heaven, as the account goes. It not only consumed the ox, but it consumed the whole altar and the water that was in it. Was it a ball of lightning? Who knows? But something answered to this confident request that would be the way a child would speak to the one that it believed had in its heart to bless. And the children of Israel were absolutely astonished. And to the person they said, the Lord is God. Yahweh is the divine reality, and not this other vision that is so painful. It was one of the great moments in the development of what we call today monotheism. The notion that we today take for granted, we don't even think about it because it's been poured into us for so many centuries, that this is a universe and not a multiverse, that there is a coherence to reality because there is a single source behind it all, and that to the face of mystery there is smile and not scowl. All of this got strengthened that day, and from that day forward, monotheism made progress in the great struggle to figure out what is the shape of the mystery. It was one of the great high points in the religious development that lies behind us. Well, as soon as the fire came, there was another sign that Yahweh really was the true God, because rain began to fall, and the drought was broken. And so with the coming of fire and the coming of rain, the religious vision that Phoenicia had imported into Israel was badly refuted. And Elijah is absolutely delighted. And so he says to Ahab, let's go tell Jezebel what has just happened. Let's give her this convincing image, this convincing evidence. And so he is so excited that he runs on foot in front of Ahab, who's driving horses, and they get back to Jezreel, which is where Jezebel is, and they tell Jezebel, and lo and behold, she, like Queen Victoria, is not amused. She did not, for 1 minute, accept that demonstrable evidence that had been acted out there on the mountain. And let's face it, friends, one of the great problems when it comes to our perceiving the truth is that we know too much. Anthony DeMello says, we see often not as it is, but as we are. What I'm suggesting is that when you have made up your mind ahead of time what you think is the truth, I don't care what the evidence is in front of you. You'll figure out a way to make that evidence correspond to your predisposition rather than letting the evidence shape the conclusions to which you come. And that's why God never can prove himself by some great demonstration of power, because if there is in the perceiving mind a predisposition that there is no God and this couldn't be God, then I don't care what the evidence is out there. We have this fatal tendency of taking what we want to be true and superimpose that on what we see, rather than taking what we see and letting that shape the conclusions that we come to. There have been times in my life when I have wished that God would not be so elusive and so mysterious. I've wanted God to write his truth in the sky so everybody could see it, or come on television some night and block out everything else and say, now this is the truth and I want you to hear it. And yet I realize that that kind of sheer show of force does not get at the problem, that until we are willing to let our notions be corrected by reality, until we have the kind of openness that lets experience shape our concepts rather than our concepts shape our interpretation, that no matter how powerful the demonstration is, it's not going to dislodge the prejudice of the heart. A good illustration of this is back in the 1920s, Sinclair Lewis, reacting against much of the narrowness and fundamentalism, provincialism of Middle America, became a raging atheist. He took delight in having debates with people who were believers. Sinclair Lewis claimed there was no God back of this reality, that all of this was just wish fulfillment. And to prove his point, he said that he would stand in the pulpit of the First Christian Church of Oklahoma City on 12 o'clock Sunday morning and go in the pulpit and say, if there is a God, I want him to strike me dead as proof that he is alive. And so they had a bigger than usual crowd that morning at church. Always do when there's some kind of excitement like that. Come 12 o'clock, here the bold atheist stands up in the pulpit and says, there is no God. If there is a God, let him prove it by striking me dead. And nothing happened. And Sinclair Lewis said, now see, that proves that there is no God, and all his believers clapped. But the next day, a rather perceptive interpreter said, you know, what happened yesterday at First Christian Church in Oklahoma City, instead of proving there is no God, might just as easily prove that God is very merciful with one of his foolish children. What father would kill his son when the son asked him to? What father would buy into that invitation just because the son was in that kind of incredible thing? Do you see what I mean? Depending on what you took in, the same piece of evidence is 180 degrees different. Well, Jezebel did not take what happened on Mount Carmel as any kind of theological redefinition. She sends word that she is going to see to it that Elijah is going to be as dead can be before the... That he didn't stop running till he'd run all the way south through Judah, completely out of Jezebel's jurisdiction, and ran all the way to that lonely mountaintop in the desert that is known as Horeb or Sinai, the place where legend has it that Moses went up, and it was there that God gave to him the Ten Commandments. He went all the way back to that place where a strategic event had taken place, and instead of getting there and out of breath saying, well, I've gotten out of her way, and I want to thank you, God, for what you did back up there on the other mountain, do you know what Elijah says? He says, God, I've had it. I want to quit. Take my life from me. Stop the world. I want to get off. I don't want to have any more. I'm the only one left that believes in you. It is not worth it. My life is pointless. And from the exhilaration of Mount Carmel, we see our great hero plunged to the depths of depression. Here is Elijah, the unfinished human being. Elijah, capable, just like most of us, of swinging from one pole of ecstasy to the other pole of deep despair. We humans are not one thing. We are many things. We don't just feel one thing all the time. We feel all kinds of things. There is an incredible, immense diversity in our humanity. And the depression that you see in this one is a reminder that no matter how high we have the capacity to soar, there is also in us that capacity to give up altogether on life, to feel totally, completely depressed and crushed, and to want nothing better than to say, stop the world, I want to get off. And not to realize that we humans are capable of both of these wild swings is simply to deny the kind of creatures that we are. I think I've told you about a Monday morning when I was a young minister, and the day before the sermon had just not sung. It had just never gotten past my teeth, so to speak, and I knew it, and everybody else that was there knew it. And the next day I was lamenting to somebody about how poorly it had gone. And an old minister who had been there, he said to me, I've been watching you now for about 4 years. He said, you're at your best about 10% of the time. You're at your worst about 10% of the time. And the other 80% is somewhere in between. But he said, you want everything you do to be in that top 10%. And if you don't let that go, you're going to burn out. I didn't like it when he said it, but he was exactly right. Every athlete knows that you have your hot spells and your cold streaks. We are not always at our best. I hear parents come to me and say, my child is not living up to her potential. And I say, well, are you? I mean, do any of us all the time, reach up to the highest and the best? We are creatures that are born of undulation. We don't always register at the highest. And so here is something very human about Elijah, the great hero on Mount Carmel, now being the suicidally depressed person on Mount Horeb. And the wonder is to see the tender, tender way that God responds to him. He doesn't condemn him for his downness. He doesn't make him feel like he is some kind of ingrate. Look, I showed myself so dramatically, and here you are wanting to quit. There is the tenderness of a mother that understands the sickness of a child and loves the child anyway, in the way that the Holy One simply gathers up this tragically depressed creature of his. I said that a hanging mobile is a symbol of the ecological system. It is also a symbol of our humanness. We have bodies, we have emotions, we have minds, and all three of these affect the others. The way I treat my body is going to affect how I feel and what I think. The kind of ideas that I feed into my mind are going to affect my body and my emotions. The way I handle my feelings are going to have impacts on my body and on my thought. We are in interrelatedness all along. And God realized that Elijah's real problem was that he had absolutely exhausted himself. He had taken that body of his and strained it way more than it could do. And so he does a very simple thing. He says, Elijah, my boy, lie down and go to sleep. And after he slept a while, he said, here, have something to eat, and go back to sleep again. He tenderly worked with that part of the mobile that was in the worst shape, that was causing all the other commotion. And then when the body had been repaired somewhat and brought back into a sense of health, then he found him asleep in a cave, and he came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he said, I don't know what I'm doing here. I've lost my way. And as he stood in the gate of the cave, there was this earthquake that suddenly caused the whole earth to tremble. And having seen this dramatic illustration on the mountain, Elijah thought, well, maybe God is going to show me himself in the earthquake, but he didn't. Then a windstorm came by, high velocity. Maybe God is in the wind, but he wasn't. Then lightning began to flash and fire began to dance all around. He thought maybe he was going to be in the dramaticness of the fire, but he wasn't in the fire. And then when all of that dramatic stuff had passed and everything got deadly still, suddenly, the Hebrew says, there was the sound of a still, small voice. And the one who is capable of coming in any way came to that one in the simplest and the quietest of forms and said to him, Elijah, I still exist. You're not alone. I really do love you. And I still got work for you to do. You know what I think still small voice was? I think it was the sound of his breathing. I think when he got so quiet, he got in touch with the most elemental thing that was still going on, and that was the universe was giving him the gift of oxygen, and his body was capable of taking that in and then putting out carbon dioxide. When I get depressed and it seems to me like there is no point left in trying and there's nobody else that cares, if I can just get back to the most elemental thing that's going on, I'm still breathing. That becomes for me the sacrament of hope. I think the still small voice was God's way of somehow coming into the silence and saying, I wanted you to be, and I still want you to be, and you're resting in my arms of mercy. It was the thing that put Elijah back on the road again. The still small voice, the sound of breath quietly entering and quietly going out. I recommend that to you. In your lowest and deepest moments, get back to the most elemental thing that's happening, and then know that you did not create the oxygen. You're not sitting there telling your lungs to breathe or your heart to beat. You are being floated on a sea of grace that is better than anything you could have fashioned for yourself. And then take that to mean that God must want me to be and still has things for me to do. And that's what he said to Elijah. So he goes back to Judah where there's Jezebel, but he's not afraid anymore. He begins to be a mentor to Elisha. He gathers up his wisdom, his stories, and he passes them on just like I'm doing tonight. And then he realized that he had fought the good fight. He'd finished his course. He had kept the faith. That it was time now for him to move into the next stage of God's incredible, incredible ocean of becoming. And so he goes and retraces his steps, and he gets back down to the Jordan River where Israel had crossed over. And the waters parted for Elijah just like they had for Joshua when they had walked over the first time. And he goes over into Moab where Moses had died, looking over to the promised land but never having gotten there. And that's where the chariots of fire and horses came and lifted him up and translated him into the next stage of God's becoming. If you've come to any funerals that I've tried, where I've been officiant here at the church, I know you've heard me say that death is not annihilation if you have the vision of the one who blesses. Death is transition. Death is not the end of everything. It is simply the end of Act 2. When you and I are born into the world, that's the end of Act 1. We have begun in our mother's body and we've grown and complexified, and then we die to that wonderful little place that was a wonderful beginning, but not a place where we could live out our whole destiny. So we die to that little place, and we're born into this bigger place of becoming. And we begin in our birth a series of having to let go little things that we might have access to bigger things. And so we leave the backyard and we go to school. And we leave elementary school and we go to junior high school. We go from junior high school to senior high school to college. Every exit is also somehow an entrance. Every death is also a birth. And when we get to the end of our earthly pilgrimage, it's going to be the same thing, letting go something small that our hands might be open for that next big and good thing the Blesser wants to give us. I believe we're put in this world to learn to trust, to learn that whatever it was that called us out of nothing into being is one that wants to bless us. And so when we die, we don't get to the end of everything. We simply get to the next frontier where, swing low, sweet chariot, there is a love that will take us as surely as the love that took us from our mother's womb. And telling the story of Elijah, who was translated into the next stage of God's becoming, maybe that's a resource to help you deal with whatever you're having to let go tonight, in the hope that something else will be born when you turn to the future, or as you think about your own death, to know that there is something that wants you to be, and that something is everlasting and is determined to bless you, and that death is not annihilation, it's transition. There's a man named George Gordon that grew up in a poor section of Brooklyn. He went to public schools, and some teachers took interest in him. Went to City College of New York, where so many poor immigrants had climbed out of the ghetto. Again, people took interest in him. He got a scholarship to medical school, did quite well, and when he graduated, he had all kinds of options to go to lucrative practices that were being offered to him. But George Gordon couldn't forget the poor people from which he had come as he'd been raised in Brooklyn. And so, like Moses, instead of seeking for a better place for himself, he sought to make the world itself a better place. And so he went back to the Brooklyn neighborhood where he'd grown up. There was very little money, so he rented an upstairs office. You had to go up steps over a delicatessen. And for 50 years, George Gordon operated out of that little upstairs doctor's office. They paid him what they could. He never made a lot of money, but no way to estimate the kind of people that were blessed because he had faithfully, sacrificially given himself. Well, 50 years go by, George Gordon dies. The Catholic Church was overrun with people because they came from everywhere to mourn the death of their friend. And they took him out and buried him in a very, very simple plot, and everybody wished they could have put up a big monument to say thank you, but they didn't have any money. And then someone hit on an ingenious idea. They went to that little stairway that had led up to his office for 50 years, and they took the sign that had been there on the street for all those decades, and they took it down, and they put a stick over his grave, and they hung that sign on it. And everybody that came by for years later saw the simple testimony, George Gordon, M.D., upstairs. He was in that next realm of God's becoming as surely as he had been in that place of blessing during the days of his life. If the truth could be told about where you are when you have fought the good fight, finished the course, kept the faith, it won't be your name and then annihilation. Bet your life on it. If the truth could be told, your name and the one word, upstairs. Death is not the end of anything. It is simply moving to the next realm of God's becoming. And trust is the lesson we were put here to learn. God never asks us to feel a certain way, but to trust Him no matter how we feel and with all we feel. I steadier step when I recall that though I slip, you do not fall. It's not our hold on Him. It's His hold on earth, us. It is our hope.